Gareth, and he's brought a guest along. I think Gareth is not a stranger to you. He gave the inaugural talk together with alumni from our program. That is James Juma, who currently works as a cloud engineer for Silicon Overdrive. Gareth, I really want to thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule and making it a quarterly tradition to come inspire us, come educate us, come inform us, and also just give our learners an opportunity to bounce their questions against an industry-based person. You know, I live in the ivory tower as a technical trainer. I live, since it's not the ivory tower because it's a university, I can say I live in a sandbox. I live in a sandbox.
That's funny.
So
That's funny, Terence.
it's always good for this interaction to happen such that they can stop hearing my boring voice and hear the experts speak and add their voice to what is there to be said. Gareth, I'll allow you to introduce yourself, and by extension, I will want you to introduce Radhir from AWS to our learners. Over to you, Gareth.
Oh, thanks, Terence. It's lovely chatting to you again. And yeah, thanks everybody for coming. I see there's loads of people joining, so it's superb to see so many people. My name's Gareth Bowers. I'm CEO of Silicon Overdrive. I'm a developer by background as well as a solution architect on AWS. So I wear a few hats, and I also lead the well-architected practice at Silicon Overdrive. So a lot of my day-to-day roles and all things is consulting with clients and understanding what they're doing and how they're building things out and kind of reviewing it from a variety of the well-architected pillars, which would be things like security, reliability, and performance efficiency. Today, I've invited Radhir, Radhir, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you everyone for having me here. I'm Radhir Nundlall. I'm a senior solutions architect at AWS. Uh, I I've just joined AWS in January, so I'm still new to AWS, but not new to the technology. I mean, I've been working in cloud technologies for the past 15 years now. So yeah. Uh, yes, so thanks, Garrett, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak as well.
No,
Thanks so much.
it's an
Nice
absolute
meeting you.
pleasure, and thanks for joining, Radhir. Just so that everybody knows, Radhir, as he said, it's an AWS solution architect. So he's also what they would call a partner solution architect. So if there's ever any questions from ourselves as a partner when we're working with clients, we can reach out to people like a Radhir internally for um, validation or confirmation of anything and stuff like that. But otherwise, then, yeah, thanks very much, then, guys. Today we'll be talking about security in the cloud, and there's been a couple of questions sent through already, so we'll get to them at the end. So I think the format today will be I'll hand over to Radhir to present and talk for a little while, and then I will talk for probably also about 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and then see if there's things, because obviously security in the cloud, yeah, it opens up a lot of questions, and there's a lot of concerns or things that want to be addressed, and people want to make sure there's a good level of comfort. So I'm guessing that a lot of you are asking or coming from different backgrounds and understanding points. So yeah, over to Radhir.
Garrett, uh, I'm gonna switch my camera off and just share my screen quickly. So, good afternoon, everyone. As I explained, I'm Radhir Nandlal, Senior Solutions Architect at AWS. I'm a generalist architect, so that means I work on multiple different services in AWS. Uh, but security is very, very, if I could say, close to my heart. I've always liked to get involved in the security aspect of AWS. And generally, what kind of, if I would say, excites me is that if I speak to people outside of IT, even my cousins or anyone, and they hear about the cloud, the first thing they is like, is the cloud secure? How secure is the cloud? Am I going to lose my money if I put it somewhere in the cloud? So everyone has this concern about the cloud being secure or not. But here at AWS, we are one of the, if I could say, the most secure cloud providers available today. So we have a shared responsibility model. Okay. So we as AWS, we look after the security of the cloud. So meaning all the services that we have available for you, we provide the necessary services and capabilities as AWS services. Okay. And then the customer's responsibility is to secure their data and workloads. So it's up to the customer to actually secure their data, workloads, and so on. So just an analogy, right? So we provide you with all the tools. So let's take a safe, for example. We give you this massive safe that you can only open with probably biometric analysis and a second biometric analysis and etc. But if you leave the door open, it doesn't make sense. You can just walk in and out of the safe. So therefore, the tools and services that we provide you can make your data and your workloads extremely secure, but it's up to the customer at the end of the day to actually secure that data using these tools and services. Now, according to Gartner recently, they say 95% of security breaches are due to misconfigurations. Okay, so people not actually configuring their workloads and their data to meet the security requirements. Now, at AWS, we support more security standards and compliance certificates than any other offering. Okay, so support all of this. Right? This helps to satisfy compliance requirements for virtually any regulatory agency around the globe. AWS, you can be rest assured that the data will be secure and it complies to regulatory agencies around the world. So, Gareth, can we move to the next one, please? Next slide, please, Gareth. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. So these are the inherent global security and compliance controls that we have available. As I said, it's the most inherent and comprehensive security compliance controls than any other cloud offering. Uh, so this is just a slide to show you that these are some of them, but there's over 300 security and compliance uh, certifications that we have, and we have a full list of it publicly available as well. So even agencies like the Secret Service in America, etc., they all we comply with all of their regulations to secure their data. So Garrett, the next slide, please. Yeah, sorry. So we build the highest standards for privacy and data security. So AWS is vigilant about your privacy. Okay? Our customers care deeply about their data security, and we have a world-class team of security experts monitoring our systems 24/7 to protect your content. So with AWS, you can build the most secure global infrastructure, knowing that your data, including your ability to encrypt it, move it, and manage and retain it as well. So all data flowing across AWS global network that interconnects to our data centers and regions is automatically encrypted at the physical layer before it even leaves our secured facilities. So additional encryption layers exist as well. For example, VPC cross-region peering, customer service to service TLS, etc. Yes, and we actually give you the flexibility. So you could use AWS managed encryption, or you can even use your own encryption keys. So it all depends how you want to configure it, how you want to use it. So all the tools are in the toolbox. Everything is there for you to use. It all depends how you build it, how you scope it, and that's where partners like Garrett's company, Silicon, they are experts in it. They're well architected. They know exactly how to deliver this, and we rely on them to actually guide the clients on building the highest standards when it comes to security. Thank you, guys. That was me for now.
Thanks, Radhir. Maybe just another addition to your analogy of the safe there. It also doesn't help if you write your password down on a piece of paper on your desk and then leave it next to the safe or in the same room. Those sort of things are like you see in the movies whenever the person walks in and they go and look for the person's code. But anyway,
Yeah.
but yes, I think the shared responsibility model is something which a lot of you might have covered in your cloud practitioner and your various courses like that, and it's really something that needs to be well understood, just in terms of exactly what your responsibility is versus what AWS does. So from that side, it's we can get to that in the questions later. But yeah, from my side then. We've gone through the things, so I'll run through then from my side. So from my side, I'll pop the camera on just so we can say hello. From my side, the security in the cloud is something which doesn't really change whether you're on-prem or on the whether you're used to being on-prem or in the cloud. Your compliance, your standards, those sort of things, whether you're looking at PCI or GDPR or whatever sort of standards or verticals, or if you're in certain, like, maybe medical space or certain things like that, if you're getting an auditor or a regulator, they're going to come with a similar checklist. It's not going to be a different checklist whether you're where you're hosting or if you're in a single cloud or a multi-cloud. So it's really important to make sure that somebody in the organization is taking ownership of understanding compliance and governance requirements, whether that's understanding how your competitors are doing it or what is expected for in your vertical. It's something where you kind of need to be following. So for instance, I know in Kenya, there's quite a bit of local protection laws. I know that there's been a lot of talk about that and whether or not it's similarly or how closely aligned it is to GDPR, or if it's kind of better or similar. From South Africa's perspective, we've got a thing called Papaya or Poppy, which basically has a simple clause or section in it which simply states that you can host your data wherever it's secure, and if you're wanting to host it outside of the country, outside of South Africa, it must be in a place that has similar or better data privacy laws, which is why we can host it in Ireland or the EU and falls under GDPR, because the GDPR standards aren't that different or worse in any way than ours. So that's something that's very important for yourselves if you are looking at wherever you're hosting at the moment, whether it be on-prem or other local service providers. Those are always good things to just make sure that somebody is actually asking the right questions and getting an understanding of that if you are building software for that sort of an industry where you're going to be regulated or audited or expected to produce certifications. As Radhir said, AWS has probably more certifications than two or more of their competitors combined. It's one of the main reasons why we, as a partner, we do other platforms, but we have a much larger team on AWS simply because the compliance and the governance meets more clients' requirements, and it overcomes those sort of questions or blockers much easier and quicker. However, just be aware that, as with the shared responsibility, it helps you meet your compliance. It doesn't make you compliant. So for instance, AWS gives you tools to very easily, with one or two clicks, for instance, enable encryption on your database. Whereas if you were on-prem and your IT manager or your developer comes to you and says, "Hey, don't worry, Gareth, the server's, encrypted at rest and I've installed BitLocker or I've got some sort of tool," I'm going to go, "Yeah, okay, cool." Or I'm going to go, "Show me," or, "Can you produce a screenshot or can you send me something that indicates it?" How do I know that that's been done? Because again, if you're responsible for the company or the project, or you're telling the auditor X or Y, how do you know that that has been actioned? So AWS not only gives the tools that wouldn't typically in on-premise potentially take hours or days for people to change and implement, it also makes it a lot easier to monitor and check and provide reports, so that I could actually set up reports using tools that say, if an EBS is attached to an EC2 and it's not encrypted, I could have something run every day, every week, every half an hour, depending what frequency I want, that it can scan and detect, for instance, if there was something that maybe wasn't encrypted and therefore send me an alert. Maybe I feel that it's so I want to be a bit more aggressive, and maybe I don't just want to be sent an alert. I actually want to trigger a Lambda function that maybe goes and shuts down that service, so that I can honestly say, hand on heart, that my environment does not allow the running of something that is not encrypted, because that is what I've told the auditor or what the compliance officer has told me that must be enacted. So those sort of things in a normal on-premise environment require a lot more work. It can be done, and there are ways of doing it. A lot of the benefits of the security in the cloud is that you can do a lot of these things a lot quicker, a lot easier. As a partner and as a builder, the tooling is phenomenal compared to what is or was available on premise, particularly 5 years ago on premise. So it's always important to just kind of understand that chances are, whatever you're looking to build, whatever sort of questions you're looking to answer, you won't be the first person to ask. And there's a very, very good chance that AWS or cloud security in general has already encountered that problem and has a solution and a way of working around it for those sort of things. Similarly, then, always look at architecting and building securely. So we often see clients that come and say, hey, we're either a startup or we've got this separate division that's wanting to test something, and we want to know whether cloud can do X or Y. Can we do a POC? As a partner, we can apply for POC credits, proof of concept credits. So in other words, there's no cost to the client for the usage and that side of running it. But the key thing when the people are building it, and this is where we sometimes see people fall in a trap. From my background as a developer, I would always want to ask, well, what sort of a POC are we creating here? Are we creating what I would call a throwaway POC? Are we creating a POC that is likely to transition directly to an MVP or a minimal viable product, in which case you're wanting to go to market with it? So let's say we're wanting to build out, I don't know, something that you guys aren't too sure about if it can work nicely in the cloud or what the throughput would be. Maybe it's a little IoT solution. Maybe you're gathering data from sensors and you're not quite sure how the scale will work or how quickly your sales or marketing team will get customers to buy in. You don't know if in, say, 2 months' time you're going to have 100 or 10,000 devices, and you don't kind of know exactly what technology or what how to build the infrastructure. Do you look at kind of maybe more of a couple of cloud native products, like maybe an SQS or a Kinesis? Do you maybe look at maybe a more traditional sort of maybe a Kafka or something sitting on an EC2 or a VM, and you're not kind of sure exactly which methods to go? Or do you maybe go and invoke certain lambdas, or maybe even using IoT Greengrass? You kind of are a bit confused. You're seeing and you're reading up on different design patterns or things, and maybe your developers are coming back and you say, heck, guys, we can maybe test with 2 or 3 of these things, but we don't really know which one is going to work best with 10,000 users. I mean, we can all pretty much happily say they will all work with, say, 50 users, but there will be a certain point at which some of the infrastructure or the tools will work a lot better for how much data are you sending through, with what frequency, how are you wanting to do it. In which case that might be a throwaway POC. So you're really wanting to just start playing with 2 or 3 tech stacks, 2 or 3 solutions, with a clear understanding that whenever you have got enough data, run enough benchmarks, and you've made a decision, you're going to rebuild from scratch with security first. If you then rather start a POC and you say, hey, I want to create something that's going to do this, but at the end of the 6 weeks or whatever, or once we've had a user trial or something like that to get feedback, we're going to want to take that to MVP. We don't want to rebuild it because we think we've got the right tech stack. We're pretty sure it's going to scale. We're more wanting the POC maybe to gauge user response, market engagement, maybe your products, a bit on the cutting edge. Beginning of COVID, there was been a lot of people who came out with ML models or things in the data lake space or the medical space to try and do things. And those are the sort of things that you don't want to respend weeks or months rebuilding from scratch from a throwaway POC, in which case At that point, you really want to be also factoring into your POC your security from the beginning, so that when you do transition it, you don't suddenly have developers telling you, hey, we've got technical debt, we're going to need to redo this. This wasn't very secure. We just kind of hard coded the user login, and now we've got no credentials. Now we need to go rehook into a user authentication or an identity provider, or put incognito. Yeah, you can do it, but it's a heck of a lot easier to rather build that and spend 2 or 3 days at the beginning of the POC and structuring your security properly than spending a week or two, 4 weeks later, when you suddenly have a whole lot more code that you need to go back and potentially change, or change the endpoints and stuff like that. So again, I always just recommend making sure that you understand the roadmap and the implications, understand where business is trying to get to, and factor in security. I often see customers that have got a really nice product, they've really grown quite well, but a lot of the security was either inherited by somebody else who left, or some things weren't done properly, and then it becomes a bit more of a mission to change than maybe it could have been at the beginning. Which obviously leads us to a lot of the design questions in terms of how do you go about that? So there's so many things that I won't really get too much into that. I did touch some of the things in my previous talk a few months ago, just about performance and reliability and the ability to scale. The things that I often see that I wanted to touch on today was more around the concepts of public and private subnets. And AWS makes it relatively easy in terms of trying to work towards a best practice of only putting your load balance in a public subnet that routes traffic to your EC2s or your Lambdas or your EKS or whatever your compute stack wants to be, and you put that in a private subnet. And then you also make sure that your database is in a separate private subnet, so you effectively have three subnets, one public, two privates, or even six if you're then spanning two availabilities for reliability. Again, the reason why you want to consider this upfront in security is if you think of, again, the endpoints and changing your code at a later point, it becomes a bit more effort than it is to just set it up securely from the beginning. There are pros and cons. The obvious cons are if you put it in private subnets, you need things like a NAT gateway or NAT instance for your instances to send the traffic out. You need to set up the route table so that you can actually do it. But similarly, you also then need to realize that developers, if they want to access the database, if they're using SQL Workbench or whatever it is, or Visual Studio, whatever it might be to connect to the database, they will then need to either have some sort of a bastion host or have some sort of a VPN or a way of connecting to the database. Again, I often see business thinking that it has deployed everything securely in private subnets, but developers have then asked for access to the database. So IPs have been added or a subnet group has been added, which effectively makes your database publicly accessible. And if somebody else is then accessing it, maybe that developer is accessing it from a coffee shop or from the airport while they're traveling, you have to realize then that your traffic is going over public internet. You do get man in the middle attacks, or people maybe able to sniff the traffic and do things. And chances are then all of your data going back and forth to your EC2 or your database is basically in plain text unencrypted, which can be read. So again, those aren't the sort of things you really want to be telling your auditor or somebody if there is an issue or a breach, and you don't really want to be kind of putting yourself or your team in that position. So again, you've got to just make sure that you and your team are understanding the trade-offs of security, ease of access, and costs. And those are kind of where the different pillars from the well-architected come in, as to where and why. From my side as a developer, ensuring security and putting that in place from the beginning is a heck of a lot easier in the cloud than it is on-prem. Again, if you were to go to your IT manager, he's normally got all the servers in a little server room or somewhere on premise. How do you know what his route table's looking like, or where that traffic's going after it comes in from the from the fiber connection or whatever to the root box, and then where does it go from there? What can happen? The servers are secure, and the servers might be locked in a room, but generally you don't really have too much understanding of exactly how those root tables are going, and it becomes very difficult to tool it as efficiently or understand exactly how those are being things. So again, the tooling in the cloud does allow for really nice discovery and investigations and the ability to secure it and pick up and remediate. I hope that makes sense. Then two of the other things that are close to my heart as a developer as well is encryption, both at rest and in transit. Again, we sometimes see that encryption at rest isn't always enabled. From my side, I normally would ask, well, why not encrypt your database at rest? I mean, generally, if you're selling things online or you've got an e-commerce store, there's a certain level of expectation that that vendor or that supplier would be encrypting their database, so that if you're registering and putting in your name and address and cell number and something happens, that data was encrypted and protected. When would you be happy to find out that it wasn't done by that vendor? Under what circumstance would you say, it's okay? Generally not. In today's age, I think we've all kind of come to accept that if we're going to the effort of downloading an app to our phone or our PC or signing up to a things, there's a certain level of expectation on that vendor to meet certain standards. And from my way of thinking, one of them is encryption at rest. And again, cloud is generally quite easy to set up. It's normally a couple of clicks to set up. The biggest concern you're going to have is more what type of keys to do. And for those who have maybe read a bit further on some of the AWS literature, you'll see that you do get things like customer managed keys, AWS managed keys, and you can also set them up to automatically rotate. So you can implement some nice solutions relatively easily, working with a partner or somebody who's kind of got a good understanding of that. So an example would be, old school, you might have your application that talks to your database. You might have your config file or your database file where you've maybe got your host name, your username, your password, possibly stored in plain text. Maybe it's somehow masked or encrypted in the config file. But typically, when you deployed your application, you would have that config file or environment file that gets shipped with it. Then when people started using code repositories and things like that, your GitHubs, your Bitbuckets, a lot of the time you might find that people put that same environment file in the repository. Again, it meant that if your repository ever got compromised, people would have access to your database. If your database was publicly accessible, hey, makes it very easy to suddenly access every part of your customer's data. So the better method would be that your code rather runs in a private environment on AWS. Whatever is launching it, whether it's EC2 or Lambda, can rather assume a role or somehow gain temporary credentials. There are multiple ways of doing it, and there's various white papers around these sort of things if you do want to read up, depending on what sort of language or tech stack exactly how you're wanting to look at doing it. But essentially, you're wanting to lean towards using AWS roles or groups, or assuming roles or gaining temporary credentials. So that's not really your code that's doing it. It's the compute or the service that's doing it, and therefore it acquires that role when it does it. Then it can make that query to something like AWS's parameter store or secrets manager or even some sort of a password vault. And that only has access because of the assumed role or the permissions. And then that is gaining your database password to actually make the call to the database. Then you can actually set it up so that your database password automatically rotates, say every 90 days or 30 days or 365 days, depending on compliance. And it can automatically update the password in your secret manager. So you as a developer genuinely no longer know what the password is. And the only way you could find out is to go into the console and look at Secret Manager and actually find that out, because the password rotates for you automatically and the AWS services update themselves so that you don't need to know. And thereby what you start to do is create environments where developers don't really need access. They more get managed by your administrators. And so you start to remove the human element, which is probably the biggest culprit for most data breaches, security breaches, social engineering, all of those sort of things which have been occurring over the last decade. So there's just a lot of ways and tools of doing it, and it becomes really quite a fascinating sort of thing to read up about and kind of just try and help your team upskill around a lot of the security. You don't need to know everything. What you need to do is try and focus on what makes sense for your tech stack or where your team's comfortable, or outsource that component, but just be aware that if you're not hearing certain things from your developers or your teams, that's probably not being done. That's from my side is kind of the key things to just kind of highlight from to people. If you're more overseeing, or if you're the visionary, or you're the person who's kind of working with the developers, yeah, it's always good to just understand or kind of get a sense of how people are doing it, and then make sure that that is vetted by a solution architect like a Radhir or ourselves, so that certain set of standards can be looked at and stuff. Also, then with encryption in transit, you get mainly two types of encryption in transit. You get what would be termed end-to-end, which would be an expectation that the traffic encrypted from your browser, say, Firefox or Chrome, to the load balancer, to the server, to the database is all encrypted. In other words, everything across the line would be encrypted. Or if you just want client to server, that would mean potentially that if your thing is reading and writing between EC2s in your environment or to the database, that traffic might not be encrypted if there haven't been additional certificates put in there. Is that a problem? Should it be? That really requires on business to define it, and as well as looking at what compliance requires around it. So from the well-architected perspective, it doesn't state it must or it mustn't. It states, have you enforced what business has defined or what compliance requires? So if you haven't gone through that from the compliance perspective, that generally would be the first place to start, or work on a security first principle and encrypt everything always. That therefore, makes life a lot simpler down the line for any conversation. Again, it's always great to try and just automate and script as much as possible. It again removes the need for a lot of developers in the account. It also can automate things so that if you're at a point where you say, well, my POC is now going to MVP, I've now got 50 users, I'm now in production, I need a separate staging environment or a separate dev as well. I need to be able to then script it, try and make sure that the infrastructure is identical, make sure that developers don't really need to mess around too much in either of them, try and automate testing so that you can do it. And again, it just makes the environment more secure so that you have as few fingers in the environment as possible, because then you can really kind of isolate if anything does change as to who did it and why. So here's a lot of the AWS services. I'm not going to go through all of these. There's a couple that I'm going to call out over the next few slides. So the next few slides kind of just isolate a lot of these in things. But what I wanted to highlight at a top level is really just how many services kind of have been added to the AWS stack over the last probably 8 to 10 years to really make it a lot easier for development. If you were to look and see which of these weren't available, say in 2013 or 2015, you'd probably find quite a few of these wouldn't be on this list, and certainly not all of the functions and features that they give to builders now would have been there's been a lot of enhancements done over the last few years. So there's really been a lot of change to cloud security. So it's really an impressive set of improvements and stuff. So the first one is more around the identity and access management, which, as you know from your console, is very much how you access and work with your users, what permissions you give them. You try and you grant them as little things, or what generally is termed least privilege. And then you've got various tools to help you with that. So you've got IAM, you've got an identity center, you've got things like a resource access manager, you've got organizations where you can actually structure multiple accounts so that you can inherit permissions, so that if you've end up with, say, 2 or 3 products that you've gone to market with, and each of them has a prod and a staging account, and you've got a separate account for your logs and your backups. You maybe have 8 or 9 AWS accounts. You want to be able to manage that easily and effectively, and normally you would do that through things like AWS organizations or AWS Control Tower or things like that, which are aimed at simplifying the IAM and the users and permissions inheritance, so that you don't have to worry too much about that in every account and stuff. And again, there's certain other services. Cognito is very much more for builders, and it highlights a lot of um, the ability to offload your authentication authorization layer, so that you don't have to worry about the user pools and stuff like that. The services for detective controls, these are phenomenal. So you've got a lot of these things. I'm not going to go into all of them, but things like Security Hub, Guard Duty, Inspector are really good once you're getting to that point of, going to production, and then considering, what these things exactly do, what does your workload do, and if or when you will need them. CloudWatch, Config, CloudTrail, VPC flow logs, I would pretty much recommend from the day you start, or from get-go. These are really good at, whatever type of workload, even a POC. They can give you a lot of insight in terms of usage, what's happening, and also help you just remediate if suddenly something stops working. Particularly when you're doing a POC, can also help, with the developers and just understanding things. The infrastructure portion is very much looking at the firewall manager. So what's nice about firewalls, the AWS Firewall Manager, for those of you who've never used it or don't know, is it comes with a set of managed rule sets, so that you can now out the box say, hey, mine's a PHP application. I would like to apply the Apache and PHP rule sets for SQL injection and certain ports that come standard with that. Or I'm running SQL Server, and therefore there are different rule sets that come packaged as managed firewall blocks that are relatively easy to set up and are largely one-click deploys to put in there. Similarly, things like Shield, private cloud can be very, very useful. Virtual private cloud would be, maybe also very key in terms of if you've got a multi-cloud platform. So if you've got services at other clouds, you can look at possibly creating a site-to-site VPN or some other way of structuring it. Similarly, with a lot of these sort of services, you really just want to understand your architecture and how the multi-cloud is likely to work. Data protection is, again, very much more for the compliance side. So for instance, this comes down to your keys and key management service. Cloud HSM is very much more for people in the PCI space, or people who maybe want more hardware devices to manage a lot of the keys. And this then comes with a very different price point to, say, normal KMS. Certificate Manager is something that I'm sure most of you would have seen or used. It's the commonplace of how to set up a lot of your certificates, even if you're just using the load balancer to store them. Secrets Manager, I mentioned earlier, could be a way to offload the secrets or your environment variables from your code to an AWS managed service. So maybe just something to note is, and this is something that a lot of clients do ask, is should I be using AWS managed services? Should I be using third parties? That really depends if you are multi-cloud, or if you want to be able to be viewed as cloud agnostic. Either maybe you've got venture capital, or there's a certain expectation of it or not. Generally, AWS services integrate incredibly well with their own services. A lot of the third-party providers put a lot of time and effort into making sure that their services integrate just as tightly, and a lot of them can be deployed very easily through Marketplace. So it really is just about making sure that you're trying to find the right tool for the job. There's very seldom a simple answer in terms of what is the right tool for the job, and you'll often find a lot of the tools overlap in terms of functionality, and can do things very, very similarly. So it really does come down to just seeing, look, are there other password vaults? Are there other things that can do VPNs? Yeah, look, you can run your Fortinet VPNs from an EC2 and you manage it that way. It means that you need to manage the EC2 and potentially patch it, as opposed to the AWS managed service will look after that side yourself, and therefore mean that you don't need to be looking at that side yourself every month or two. It also means that the chance of it going down is less. So there's always sort of things that you need to just understand with a lot of the services and the things. And then incident response, again, just speaks to ways to kind of maybe find things and get to the root cause quicker. An event bridge can also help with a lot of the ability to scale things and stuff like that, as well as the AWS backup. And again, AWS backup is a phenomenal service. And I think it's one of those things that, again, you need to push back to business to define what and how they're wanting backups to occur, rather than developers just leaving it as the default rolling 7-day backup or whatever, because maybe business has an expectation that the database is backed up for 90 days or a year, or there's certain things that maybe can be done very easily, but maybe that conversation has just not kind of happened. So again, from a security perspective, as well as from maybe reliability or things like that, you really just want to kind of make sure that those conversations are happening. And as a developer, from my side, often the easiest is to push that back to business and make it somebody else's decision to make. Normally, the data officer or compliance officer or CEO would be responsible for signing off on that. Then compliance and stuff, and as Radhir mentioned at the beginning, Artifact is a AWS service which largely allows you to download a lot of the documentation around services. So if you're using KMS and you're being audited and they're asking, is your certificate 128 or 256, then you can say, well, look, let's go to Artifact. We can download it, and that will have whatever documentation you're looking for. If they say, well, how is physical access to the data center? Is it being restricted? Are people needing to sign in? How is patching done? How is data rotation done? Artifact will contain all of those sort of things, so that it takes all of that load off you and your team. Again, if you were on premise, that would be something you would need to take ownership of. So if you were going through like a full PCI audit and you were doing on-premise work, you would need to be providing access logs of who's come into your building, who's gone into your data room where your servers are, what is your patching routines, who had physical access, what is the remote things, all of those things that AWS basically takes over up until the hypervisor level, you would need to be doing, and you would be doing or should be doing if you were running serious on-premise workloads at the moment that were requiring auditors and stuff. It's a phenomenal amount of work, particularly if you've got multiple sites. Generally, you'll find that a lot of companies have blueprints or run books of how to then roll out what needs to be in place, what are the processes and procedures, and therefore a lot of that does or can be put in place. But again, if you're hosting in the cloud, AWS goes to an awful lot of effort to make sure that their services are PCI compliant very soon after launch. And you will generally find very few services that have been around for a little while that aren't meeting certain compliance and standards, because they want customers to use them, and they don't want to find that people aren't able to use them because they're not meeting whatever requirements or compliance for their vertical. So there's an awful lot of effort that goes in to help people like us be able to audit and assist customers building things. And then, as I mentioned, there's a lot of companies that specialize or come from on-premise backgrounds that have, got cloud products offerings, and a lot of these times, a lot of the services might integrate better for a customer than, say, some of the AWS services. Some of them might be more holistic or easier to deploy or have certain features. So some of the ones that I'm familiar with that we as Silicon use is Fortinet. We come from a strong background of using Fortinets and Palo Altos and things like that for more on-premise in the things. We have used Cisco's, but for whatever reason, we've generally tended towards certain brands being in South Africa. But a lot of the companies should be familiar to you guys in terms of certain things. You know, Trend, Semantic, CrowdStrike. We ourselves use Trend a lot. We find a lot of their products work really well. They've got even some really nice products for serverless specific stacks. So even if you're purely running Lambdas or on Kubernetes or Fargate, and it's purely serverless, they've got certain other products that are specifically designed just for containers or for serverless to make it a lighter weight agent. So a lot of these companies will have a lot of very tight integration with the AWS services that will make it a lot easier than you trying to do certain things in your application. So again, it can remove a lot of the burden off your team by seeing if there are certain other products that can facilitate that. There will probably be a license cost. There will be some sort of a monthly cost or whatever the engagement is. But again, you know, is it better to pay a couple $100 for a license than give it to a developer or a DevOps who might spend half a month and not get it working as well? The risk and the time to market is generally much shorter. And unless you've got a large scale, it's generally going to be a much cheaper kind of total cost of ownership to be considering it. But again, it depends on the workload and depends on a lot of those things. So I think from a top level, that was largely what Radhir and myself wanted to cover and run through. Security is a very broad topic, and it's obviously something which AWS puts first and builds all of their services around. And as a partner, it's something that we always make strong recommendations to customers where we really want to put security first and make sure that, you know, those things are well considered. And it's a fascinating topic that has changed hugely over the last few years. As you probably all kind of follow to some degree, there's obviously been an increase in cyber attacks and, you know, ransomware and various things over the last 5-8 years as well. So these things do need to be, you know, constantly looked at, and we also need to understand why are there so many third-party companies that do have really strong products on this if there wasn't a need for it, and if they're using it, why shouldn't small people be able to do it and access it, and therefore look at the license costs and the offering? So even startups and POCs should still be considering what or when to be able to do it. So yeah, hope that kind of gives a lot of overview and perspective and stuff. I know there were some questions that were sent through. Terence, would you like me to put them in the chat and speak to them, or would you like to open up for questions first?
Sorry for that.
Okay, you can shoot the first question, Samuel.
Oh, okay. Thanks a lot. My first question was, I wanted a clarity on if you're done with the AWS certified certification. Is it that you only can do work for Amazon only, or after you're done with this certification, you can also do a work besides Amazon?
Very good question. So generally, if you've done an AWS solution architect or developer, you would only be certified to work on Amazon's stuff. But you'll find that the equivalent exams on the other platforms have the exact same concepts, but the terminology might be different. So for instance, the name of the Lambda on Azure might be called, I think it's called functions. You know, so a lot of those things might just take a bit of brain space from your side just to kind of be able to map or translate. But the concepts of scalability and the reliability would all be kind of similar, but some of the components might be fractionally different. So in essence, if you were applying to a job and somebody was looking for an Azure developer and you had the AWS cert, I think it's something they would certainly look at and say, well, you know, hey, Samuel probably understands it and it won't take him that long to get it compared to somebody who doesn't have anything on his background. But if they've got a requirement or a compliance things that say that their developers must be Azure certified, then, you know, it wouldn't maybe work for you. So, you know, you do sometimes see people who kind of do multi-cloud certifications. From our side in Silicon, we have more specialized teams so that we don't generally have too many people that are cross-platform certified. We rather have people in different teams that are certified, but we don't prevent people. So it really does come down to, yeah, what is your focus, and are you trying to be a jack of all trades or more of a master of one? Does that answer your question, Samuel?
Definitely, yes. That means it gives you a broad idea into the technology that involves with Amazon platform as well as other platforms like emailing and so on.
Yeah.
So
As I said,
you are
yeah.
ahead of.
Yeah, no, look, again, you'll find that some platforms are a lot more similar. So I can't speak for all of the platforms. I mean, I'm aware of the main big three, but like other ones like, I don't know, DigitalOcean or Linode, there might be a lot more work to doing some of the features that you're used to under AWS or things like that. So yeah, I'm not an expert on those.
My concern there was, should it be like Amazon is just one institution, even though it's big as we can imagine, but it might not be able to employ. Should it have more learners coming through from this angle, and then Amazon have to employ all of them? Definitely, not all of them will be employed. So I was just asking this question to see this knowledge share will also enable most of us to be able to find ourselves should we not get a job in or land a job in Amazon.
Yeah, look, I think it really just comes down to kind of getting a sense of the market and what people are looking for in your area, or what sort of companies you're looking to apply for, and then kind of things. But yeah, from my experience, cloud is cloud, and the concepts are largely very similar regardless of things. But as I said, you might then just need to think. So maybe to put in perspective, if you spent a month doing your solution architect for AWS, you might find it takes you half the time or a quarter of the time to do a similar one on another platform, and vice versa. It's a lot of the time, from my perspective of doing the exams, is really just kind of understanding the concepts and what is possible, rather than the names of the specific service or those sort of things. But again, each person might be different or coming with a slightly different background, and therefore take quicker or long or slower to pick up those things and stuff, Samuel.
Thanks a lot. I get you. Thanks so much.
As to your other question there, as to whether or not AWS limits you to work only for Amazon, no. I'm sure that Radhir is, I mean, he's, might very well have other cloud certificates that he's worked for in the past. And, I don't think there's any limitation or anything around that.
No, not at all. Yes, unless you're an employee of AWS, then you obviously you're going to be limited to working for AWS.
It would be a bit weird, Radhir, saying, "Hey, I've just got this other cert," But yeah, there's no general limitation, guys. It's most companies want people to upskill and learn where their focus is and what they're employed to do. But if you're an external or a partner or something like that, then Samuel, then yeah.
So just to mention, earlier this year in January, we hired a Microsoft cloud certified person who didn't even have a single AWS certification, but he came out good in the interview, So yeah, and now he's got AWS certifications as well. So yes, the scope is open. Yes.
Just also to that, guys, I mean, I work with one of the AWS teams that do a lot of the modernization programs, and everybody in that team has got a very strong Microsoft background, because Microsoft in the cloud, I think Radhir can correct me, I don't know if this is still true, but there was more Microsoft workloads running on AWS than there were on Azure.
Yes, so we even got a Microsoft practice in AWS as
well. So
yeah.
Again, those certs are very useful because it helps a lot of the solution architects or the developers help deep dive questions in terms of how do you run EC2 clusters on EC2 if you don't want to put it on RDS, or how can you perform this function that you could on-prem with an enterprise license cheaper in the cloud. Or, if you don't have people with deep knowledge of how those things work, you end up spending a lot of time trying to research it. So as Radhir says, there are teams that are specialized with that, that are, I wouldn't say cross-platform or whatever, but they certainly are multi-skilled and multidisciplinary in terms of being able to assist customers with specific questions. And you'll probably find it's the exact same for things like SAP and Oracle and all of those. all of AWS's products have to have teams that can deep dive and do deep technical questions to help companies migrate their workloads and run them efficiently. Emmanuel, I see your question's up.
I wanted to know, in your experience working with clients, have you ever encountered a scenario in which a cloud solution wasn't viable due to compliance or security issues? And if yes, could you share what those issues were?
There could be scenarios where there's yes, I can, absolutely. So I once had a client in another African country where their internet reliability was poor. In which case cloud doesn't make sense. You need a strong offline capability. They were running in a country or location where internet might be off for 10 minutes, an hour, or it might suddenly go off for 4-6 hours at a time, and therefore you can't run a business like that. So they needed a way of doing it, and no matter what you want, cloud's not really going to help. You do need some other way of doing data syncing or being able to do a lot of the things and stuff like that. So there could be scenarios where there might be. Generally, from a compliance perspective, I mean, there's a lot of banks, there's a lot of insurance companies, there's a lot of people who are more traditionally on-premise that are moving to the cloud. There's a lot of case studies around those that are being made public to kind of highlight those sort of ventures in terms and success stories. And yeah, as I said, from my side in South Africa, pretty much all of our banks are on the cloud. Most of them, as far as I'm aware, definitely have an AWS presence. Most of them might or might not have a multi-cloud. And in South Africa, in the last 4 years, I think we've actually opened up 3 banks that are purely digital and online that don't even have stores. So the perception of things needing to be offline is kind of getting challenged by the refresh cycle of people's licensing and hardware and stuff, because a lot of the times the larger companies have really, really large costs. You might find that one server costs over $1 million, for the hardware and licensing. So a lot of the time these things have stupid amounts of RAM and compute, and they've got costs involved that we just don't kind of normally understand in terms of being normal people on the street and stuff. So, there definitely are certain things. Radhir, I mean, is there anything where you would say might be more of an advisement not to move to the cloud kind of things, or in your scenario, would you say everything should be fine or can be looked at?
I think most can be looked at, with the exception of obviously the internet bandwidth in some countries. Some countries they also have some data residency compliance, which we're working around. I mean, we've got things like Outposts which we can deploy and definitely get them to a cloud type scenario. But yeah, generally I would say the restriction is infrastructure and not really anything else, any other challenge.
How does AWS respond to security incidents? What's the process? So what you would need to do is you log a request ticket in your console, or you send through a support ticket, and then AWS normally picks that up and responds to it. And depending on your support, whether it's developer support, business support, will just depend on the exact nature or turnaround time and those sort of things. But again, as Radhir said, the security of your application is your responsibility. So AWS can assist, but there is a limit to what or how much they will deep dive into your code or your actual kind of things to find out. If it looks like you got SQL injected, they're not going to ask for your code or your SQL statements to find out if that, kind of was the case. There's a certain level of responsibility from your side. If they can pick up the logs where it was coming from, what was happening, if they can advise further as to what services should be implemented or can be done to, mitigate it happening again or things like that, that is kind of the sort of things that they would be focusing on for the most part. Yeah. Then the next question next question that I got asked is, what are the key decision-making factors for clients when deciding which security and compliance framework to follow through in a multi-cloud environment? Sure. I would say that you need to kind of do a bit of research and investigate or understand what are the different frameworks and what are they there to achieve. Because there might be differences from, like, if there's an auditor, or what is the expectations from your industry, and that should help you guide or help guide you as to which framework to use. So a lot of companies in, say, PCI might use the a certain compliance structure. PCI itself is largely a checklist and gives a very good overview. Things start getting a bit more vague if you move into other industries, like maybe insurance or things like that. But there are specific frameworks that can be used, and then obviously understanding what auditors are looking for and what their pain points will be looking for will go a long way to understanding it. So the next question that I got sent are, what are the advantages of working in a multi-cloud environment from a security and compliance standpoint? Sure. Okay, so again, this is multi-cloud always will bring up a few more complexities, simply because, as I explained at the beginning, you can secure your workload quite easily by moving a lot of the components into private subnets using private endpoints within your VPC, and therefore you don't have traffic going out over the public internet. Multi-cloud, if you don't want traffic going out over the public internet, you would then need to be looking at some form of VPNs, or kind of how you're wanting to make sure that you've got secure connections. If you're running a AWS workload with a on-premise workload, the general recommended way is using something like a VPN or a dual VPN for redundancy. And if you've got enough data moving, maybe using something like a Amazon Direct Connect, or something which guarantees or provides a more solid pipeline and stuff. But I think the key is really to just understand, what are your endpoints, what data is needing to be moved, how much data are you needing to move, and then just making sure that you've got adequate. And then in terms of security, you really kind of want to be looking then at products or tools of making sure that you've got an holistic view of your security. And if you've got AWS specific services, make sure then you've got similar services in the other environment, or make sure you've got some way of providing an overview of the environment. And that's generally where multi-clouds can become a bit more tricky, is just to kind of ensure that everything is well looked at and equally considered and stuff. Then the next question, let's have a look, is what is the future of cloud security, considering that many businesses are migrating to the cloud and the traditional on-prem data centers are being depreciated? How can those businesses ensure that their data is secure and confidentially safe? Yeah, as I said, I think there's a general consensus from most security experts that security in the cloud is probably more secure and easier to maintain than stuff on-prem. On-prem often doesn't have quite the same degree of transparency, but maybe is this something that maybe Radhir can speak to?
Yes. So I guess the future of cloud security is ever evolving, right? As you've seen, the services that we had a few years ago compared to the services we have now has really been upped a lot, right? So we see that there's definitely uptake in cloud in general, and obviously security is our foundation in AWS. We do everything based on security. So everything that we develop, we make sure it's secure. You know? So the future of it is continuously evolving, and make sure that we always provide the best. That's our thing. Currently, we provide the most, from everybody else. But yeah, sure.
Yeah, as I said, from my experience as a partner and other things, is the a lot of the services and the depth within them compared to 5, 6, 7 years ago is phenomenal. So a lot of those have been around security and ability to integrate things, or particularly around like a multiple accounts or certain things around the best practice and security and stuff. So it's certainly evolved a lot, and it will continue to evolve, because security is by far probably one of the fastest moving things. Obviously, AI ML has made a huge set of leaps in the last year as well. And I don't see that slowing down, but security will always be something that is well factored. There's a question from Emmanuel. How would you suggest someone go about getting into cloud security if they are just starting out and currently taking their cloud practitioner certification? So I think security, it depends if you're looking at it from more of a infrastructure point or more of a code perspective, or a bit of both. So you've started hearing a lot of terms like now, instead of just having your developer or your DevOps, you now have DevSecOps. You now have people that maybe look at certain things. So basically, roles or specializations are kind of being created in the market, and it depends what your interest is, Emmanuel. From my perspective, I would say read up on the SysOps and the DevOps courses. They give you a lot of understanding around code pipeline, CI/CD things. If you don't understand those, you're always going to struggle with some of the concepts around bigger picture security and working with other companies or their dev teams and stuff like that. From there, it becomes a lot easier to move towards doing your security specialty. And then just there are other companies that do specialize in security, and they maybe do it multi-platform, they maybe do it just on AWS, and there are security certs that are designed for that. I can't remember them all. There's a lot of other security things, or you could look at focusing on a specific area that interests you. So if you were, say, a Linux engineer or a Microsoft engineer, you might find that there are security certs and things that are more focused around those specific things, like whatever they might be, in which case that might open up a lot of doors for companies wanting that, where you're wearing that as a more specialized hat. So there's a lot of ways to get into it. I think again, the easiest often is to look at a couple of job ads, look and see what kind of looks of interest to you and that you feel is within your wheelhouse of background or understanding, and look at what they're looking for. And then kind of that'll give you or guide you a lot in terms of what you should be aiming towards, and things. But as with everything, don't look at just one, because that might not be painting a good picture, and might be stuff that maybe has changed since the last 2-3 years. So again, you want to be kind of just making sure that you're getting a sense of where the industry is going, and start following companies that specialize in a lot of the security things and recommendations. Get a sense of best practice, read up on it, and that should give you a good idea of what you don't know and what interests you. You might find that some of it is just a bit too technical on the dev side or the Linux side or the this side or whatever kind of things. I'm not sure. That's generally my experience, is that people that thrive in the security space want to learn an awful lot, and just want to be immersed with it. But you need to just see where's your interest and stuff. Here's an interesting question. Sorry, Radhir, did you want to say something there?
Right. I'll answer Lorraine if you'd like, Gareth.
Yes, go for it.
Yes. So, Lorraine, we at AWS have security specialists monitoring 24/7. So everything that's on AWS, the data centers, the services, etc., has all been monitored 24/7. We try to pick up early detections of possible things that could break or could penetrate. We're always making sure we're at the latest level of stuff. We're trying to curb the attacks and stuff. So there's people watching this 24/7, and we've got the best of the best actually doing this for us.
Yeah, just maybe to add to that, I actually went to a really nice talk presentation by your WAF and Shield team that were down from overseas a few months ago. Radhir, and they were quite fascinating. So there was two guys in the presentation that are part of, as Radhir says, there's a lot of teams that do the constant monitoring, and they basically said that on any given day they have something like several hundred denial of service attacks that are constantly happening to various AWS accounts or things, and 99% of the time they get resolved without the client even being aware of it. Their technology behind the scenes, and for those of you who've done your solution architect or read up further around that, a lot of the AWS technology and the things they build themselves, so they don't buy from a lot of the traditional hardware vendors. So like a lot of the hardware routers and those sort of things are kind of custom built, or they've got their own factories dedicated to it. And they actually can route the traffic. So if you're finding denial of service is hitting the one region or the one availability zone or the one things, they can actually route a lot of that traffic and distribute it so that it is not really affecting the services in that as a zone by routing a lot of the traffic or those denial things elsewhere, so that they basically can mitigate it without kind of need to putting more resources in, because there will always be available capacity to a certain degree in certain places, and generally AWS's backbone and network infrastructure will probably far exceed the average person's ability to do a denial of service or certain other things. So they've got really quite sophisticated software that can pick it up real time, and to be able to handle it, they've gone through it. Again, it just speaks to the depth of experience and innovation over the last decade compared to on-prem is still using the similar sort of paradigms that were there 20 years ago. And no on-prem is really designed to be able to handle things like denial of service or things. Are they even aware of brute force? For the most part, on-premise stuff relies on security by obfuscation. They assume people aren't aware of it. They kind of assume that the endpoints are very minimal or hidden. But the reality is, hey, if you stole somebody's laptop who had access to that connection or the VPN, would their IT manager even be aware that you were trying to brute force? Would a lot of things, be in place that you might assume would be in place, but are they in place? You don't know. So yeah, in general, the cloud and the AWS stuff is incredibly well tested and robust. Maybe just then to answer the other question, just to Lorraine, from our side as a partner, we generally always make recommendations for our migrations or our environments that we build out to use a lot of these security services. So that, that would be config, CloudWatch, CloudTrail, Guard Duty, and WAF and things like that. So we normally would have a chat with the client, try and get them to just understand what are the benefits and potential costs of these services, and just make sure that they understand what are they trying to achieve. Is it a production workload? Is it a POC workload? What are they, what is their budget? What are they looking to spend? What is their amount of traffic? And kind of just work through that with the client to kind of make sure that those things are understood, so that we are trying to facilitate customers understanding and having a good AWS experience or a good cloud experience or a good development experience, and that the requirements from business are being met. So that is largely where we apply a lot of our knowledge and understanding in terms of that. I see Manuel has another question. Does AWS have vulnerability assessment services? Yes, there definitely are. So if you're looking at things, something like Inspector or Config or Trusted Advisor would pick up a lot of things. How's it, guys? Would pick up a lot of those sort of services, and there's obviously a lot of AWS or vulnerability services and things. So yeah, that definitely things. But again, it depends what sort of vulnerabilities. If you're more looking for patches on your servers or public endpoints, there's a lot of services that can do that. And again, this will come back to questions in your risk assessment or compliance as to which services might be used to be able to do it, etc. And I think Ben Bedden is just saying that he's got issues connecting, so that's fine. Let me keep then running through the rest of the questions then, Terence. I think there's only 2 or 3 more from Janet's side. there was a question asked, is there's opportunities for professional development and training in cloud technologies as an employee in your company, and do you support cloud certification programs? So as Silicon, we don't have a current internship program. We do, however, encourage all staff to study and study continuously. Things are obviously constantly changing. Even if you did your solution architect 2 years ago, AWS has a built-in thing where your cert only lasts for a period of time and then you need to recertify because things change. What you learned 3 years ago might not be best practice anymore, particularly on security and other things. So yeah, we do offer incentives and stuff to staff to constantly study, and Radhir can speak to it. But AWS obviously have vast programs for learnerships, upskilling. I think I did see a little while ago there was a program to try and upskill like 1,000 people within a period of time. I think it was 3 months or 6 months, but maybe Radhir knows more.
Yes. So I'm not actually very clued up with it, but I've seen the comms that went out, and yeah, the idea is to actually skill up a lot of people in the cloud. There were
Yeah.
also the Women in Tech initiative where they wanted to skill up a lot of females in AWS as well. So they offered like free exams and so on. But just look out for that because they generally publicly publish these things. So maybe look out in LinkedIn, look out in the other social networks. So there's always these opportunities.
Yeah, but just in general, from my experience, AWS puts a lot of effort into programs and funding because they recognize that as partners, we need to hire people with skills on the AWS who can then join us and help clients. They obviously realize that they themselves are growing and hiring people, as well as, if you've got ideas and things, you need to be able to upskill and things and want to go through programs. And that's where, people like Azubi and others really flourishes. There is a much bigger demand for skills than the training, but AWS are trying to address it through multiple programs and stuff. So if you want more information, I'm sure that Terence can probably find out or provide, or if not, then Radhir can certainly send through information around that if you want. Maybe indicate what area and things like that. But yeah.
Yes, definitely yes.
Samuel,
See
you have your
Samuel.
hand up.
Yeah, Samuel.
Okay, a quick one. I think it's a security question. My question is very simple. Do AWS IAM or AWS and any other security that we don't know handle a situation or remedy a situation whereby you as the owner have assigned a portion or security portion that enables your client to have a full access to your S3 bucket, and his laptop or his device get double up, like someone takes it?
Yeah,
What
absolutely. So the
Mhm.
easiest would be, so you could either do it via the AWS IAM itself, or in S3 you've also got its own NACLs and control lists and stuff, Samuel. So generally the easiest would be in the IAM, create a role with access to that bucket, and then let the user in the other account assume that role, so that then they don't actually have a user in your account, and they can then just simply assume that role with access to the bucket. Or you could provide an access key, and then you do get third-party products that people use on their PCs to be able to upload files to buckets, and then they can use that key to kind of access your bucket and stuff. So it depends what they're going to be doing and how much you trust them, or if they're just needing to put files on there, or kind of what exactly they're needing. But generally, like if you had an auditor or somebody that needed access to files, you would give them read-only rights, let them assume the role, or certain methods like that, Samuel. But again, there's multiple ways to skin the cat, and it's not a new question. So it's really then just reading up a bit about it, or seeing or asking and kind of things. But it's definitely something that can be handled through a few ways. It largely will depend on, maybe, as I said, just exactly what the person needs to be doing. Are they just reading? Are they writing? And things. Does that kind of help? So just to also clarify, there are tools that people use that can basically operate similar to like Windows File Explorer, where you can basically see your AWS bucket as a another drive on your PC, and you can actually copy files in. And a lot of people find that a lot easier to work with. So again, it depends on the person, what they're looking to do, and all of those things. Radhir, is there anything from your side you've seen that maybe is better or easier?
Yeah, so I guess there's various options, right? Based on the use case, I think we'll definitely come up with an option that's suitable and secure. You know, also things like second factor authentication and so on. So if the laptop gets lost, you need to actually authenticate using second factor to access the data in there and so on. So yeah.
Yeah, so that's a valid, yes, you need to understand the use case, how they're going to be using it, and mitigating the risks, and trying to just make sure that it's secure as possible whilst making it, able to do the purpose there, Samuel.
Okay, I did ask this question in my class, but I still want to repeat. Maybe you can have more, you can throw light more on it. The question is very simple. How do I monitor my clients?
How do you monitor your?
How do I monitor my client if what I assign to him is exactly what the areas he's exploiting?
So if you want to restrict him, you would do it in IAM, and you would only give him access to the services or the features that you want. So if you just wanted him to have S3 read access, or if you just wanted S3 full access, or kind of what you can do it there. If you wanted to see what he's actually done, you would normally use something like CloudTrail or a couple of other services, which would be more for the monitoring or the auditing process.
Okay.
Cool. I see there's another hand up. Otherwise, let's just see. I'm not sure who that is, but go for it. I think it's Lorraine.
Lorraine.
Lorraine, or is that an old hand? Might be an old
Lorraine,
hand.
you may unmute and speak.
My question is like this. Being that the cloud server hosts so many clients, hosts so many customers, do you ever experience system failure, and how do you handle that? Because this is a product, when somebody wants to opt for it, how to handle system failure in case you ever experience such?
Yeah, look, I mean, system failures can happen, but what sort of system failure? Are you saying like the EC2, or is there something specific in the system, or just in general?
In general.
So in general, we try and we architect solutions with no single points of failure. So for instance, if you're running a simple solution where you've maybe got traffic coming in or hitting your code on an EC2 with maybe your database split out to your RDS, then to mitigate that, put your EC2 in an auto scaling group, and maybe just put it in with a minimum one, maximum one, or minimum one, maximum two, so that if, for instance, anything fails on that EC2 or doesn't register as healthy, it will then spin up a second one and replace it. So ultimately, you want to understand what went wrong and why it didn't register as healthy. Was there something that wasn't triggering? Was somebody doing something on that server that shouldn't be there? Did your developers deploy code that didn't run properly and caused a memory leak, or use too much resources? Maybe your server size is too small, and you need to be looking at the metrics and CloudWatch to say, well, instead of running it as a T3 small, maybe we need to run it as a T3 medium. There could be a load of things, Lorraine, that kind of indicate or help you investigate. So the normal services would be things like CloudWatch, CloudTrail, and looking at the metrics from those to get a sense of what was the server doing at the time. And then from there, you would normally have a chat with the developers, and you say, look, this is what seems to be happening. Let's add more telemetry. Let's add more logging either to the database or to file, so that if something similar happens in future, we can then get more insights and things. On RDS, you've got an option to just go and tick performance insights, so that you can start getting a better sense of slow running queries, what might be happening, what might be causing things. Because again, you want to understand, as you're building the application and deploying it and testing it, what are users doing? What have your developers built? Is there something which maybe is still, not properly done? Is there not enough error handling? And again, let's be honest here, no developer is going to build an application with sufficient error handling from the beginning. It's something which generally is always going to need to be enhanced slightly at some point. So, you've just got to kind of make sure that you're asking the right questions and that you've got those sort of tools enabled so that if something does happen, you can then spend as little time as possible while understanding the root cause and then being able to make remediations to that and then slowly improve the product or the things. If you're fortunate to kind of, have a lot of that stuff built in from the beginning, then it should be relatively easy to do root cause analysis and understand if it's more of an application or an environment. Was there something maybe that wasn't there? Maybe it's as simple as the EC2 did restart, but maybe your AMI that spun up was old, or maybe your AMI had a hook to repull the code from the repo, and maybe something there was old or wasn't working and the latest code wasn't deployed. So when the EC2 spun up, it was actually pulling the code from a few weeks ago. Any of these things can happen, Lorraine, and that's why you kind of want to just make sure that the logging and that side of things is implemented so that your team or your engineers looking after the infrastructure have as much information as possible. Does that assist? So as I said, the main tools from our side that we would use would be CloudWatch and CloudTrail. There obviously are third-party tools that can do similar, like Grafana, Prometheus, Datadog, Splunk. A lot of those things will give you a similar insight. But in essence, you need to know what was happening on the server. You need to understand what it was doing, why certain events triggered. And then from the developers, you would need to make sure that whatever logging on the application level is happening normally at the database layer. Okay. Does that answer your question, Lorraine, or was there anything further? Okay. Cool, thanks. I think we've only got one or two more questions from the list from Janet. This one was aimed at me. So this one was saying, hi, Gareth, just a question I'm extremely curious about. From your educational background at CPUT to AWS certs, what would you say has been the most practical knowledge gained in your educational journey and used in your everyday working tasks, from a software developer to a software director to now being the CEO at Silicon Overdrive? Sure. I've been at Silicon a while, and my day-to-day experience has changed over time. So this is obviously quite an interesting question to just think back and ponder on. So thanks for the question. My experience on cloud and AWS started with doing the developer and the solution architect courses, and obviously coming from a traditional kind of background. I mean, I started with desktop development. I've been developing longer than kind of cloud has been around for the most part. So a lot of the things did take a bit of understanding and, kind of those things, but a lot of the concepts, once you've understood them, are relatively straightforward. And as a developer, they kind of start slotting in. The architecting and a lot of those things, again, once you understand how to identify single points of failure, how to ask the right questions and make sure that you're looking for services or architecture patterns or design patterns to assist you, then it goes a long way to understanding a lot of the concepts. So for instance, if you've got a lot of load on your server, understand what is your server actually doing. Maybe you can separate out a cron job or a process that's running on there that doesn't need to be on there. If it's on your database, maybe say, well, can we look at putting in like an elastic cache or a caching engine to save a lot of the work being done by the database, because it'll be cheaper to put a elastic cache in place of it than it will be to increase the size of the RDS, for instance. So a lot of these things, you really want to kind of get a good sense of what is happening through the architecture, and being able to make the most informed decision or the best decision for what your workload's doing. From my side, probably the most practical knowledge has been kind of really understanding those sort of questions and helping around the architecture, which is where I've learned a lot by doing the well architected with clients, understanding and seeing what clients are building and seeing what their sort of challenges are, has really sort of been something that I really enjoy, and kind of has probably been the result of a lot of those certs, to kind of be able to understand and work with clients and offer good insights as to what they're doing. So yeah, so from my side, I would always recommend those certs, and the developer or architect, and even the DevOps really gives you a good overview of a lot of those things. So from my side, I think those will always help any developer kind of know a bit more about what's happening. Then last question. Let's see. Was, with the increasing popularity of multi-cloud environments, how do you ensure that data and applications are secure and compliant across multiple platforms? I think we've sort of covered this with some of the previous things. I think this really then just speaks to choosing a framework that will allow you to answer this question, because ideally the compliance or security frameworks are meant to do it. So in our experience, a lot of enterprise will have a certain framework or structure that their team has decided on, or they have a cloud center of excellence or a team that focuses on making these sort of cloud decisions, and they will generally guide you. If you yourself as a startup or somebody that's wanting to go into fintech or something like this, unfortunately, you're probably going to need to appoint someone in your company to take ownership of this and kind of have a look at it, or chat to some of your other people or competitors or partners, and see what they're doing and what their experience is. There's not really a simple one answer fits all. But in essence, you really want to be trying to move a lot of the responsibility to AWS, to tooling, and seeing what they bring to the party. What does a trend do? What does an NOps do? What does a Splunk do? What does a Datadog do? What tick boxes are they actually doing or addressing on your risk assessment? So if you're wanting to go into fintech, if you're wanting to deal with an e-wallet, if you're wanting to do this or that or whatever, what are you wanting to be able to do? What are you needing, and how do these other vendors do it? And have an open or frank conversation with them. They're never going to tell you they can do X if they don't. They will tell you where their benefits are and how their products work, and then it's largely going to be up to you to kind of try and work out which ones are overlapping or which ones aren't, or what you're needing to do to achieve it. But it's really then just kind of starting down that road to just understanding what and what you need, and what is things. And again, the frameworks are there to really guide you and provide the structure, to try and make it easier for both yourself and then the auditor or the person coming in who reviews it and stuff. So yeah, it's again, it's not something new. It's something which people have been asking and doing. Banks and all of these people would have been doing it for years before they moved their first workload across. All of these sort of things have already been pretty considered and stuff. So there's a lot of deep discussions around this. AWS does spearhead a lot of those conversations with government or enterprise to try and help with policies and understand data, or local data laws and things like that. So there's a lot of these sort of questions that if you do have more specialized questions, somebody like a Radhir can probably put you into the contact with the right person who might have detailed knowledge about that, or be able to provide white papers about, why is there this or there that. But just maybe to also clarify that I don't think they are in Africa, but like in London and America, there are things that are called AWS Gov Clouds, or which are basically specifically designed to meet compliance for certain things around governments, or certain things where maybe they're different to the rest, and maybe those are not really that different to what the rest of us are doing. But again, there's a lot of conversations being had that mean that you don't really need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to ask the right questions or read up on the right things and find that framework or those structures and what services you want to look at implementing. Hope that answers that. Otherwise, that's largely it from the questions I was given from Janet, guys. I don't know if there's any others.
Okay, I think from Azubi Africa and our learners, it is a lot of gratitude on behalf of our organization to you, Gareth, and by extension, the guest you brought along from AWS Radhir. We're looking forward to more of this. As you can see, we have an ever-increasing body of learners that is eager to find out more, and we really find a lot of value in this interaction that is outside the normal training we undertake on a day-to-day basis, and simulating labs and trying out chapter quizzes and knowledge checks and that type of thing. I think this type of interaction enables our learners put things into context. So we are very, very, very grateful for you having taken time out of your busy schedules and spent time with us this afternoon. All I can say is thank you.
No, pleasure, absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having us, Terence.
Most welcome.
Cool.
Yes, absolute pleasure.
My last point would just be this. Never accept the stuff that you knew or learned 6 months ago or 12 months ago. Cloud moves quickly. Even engineers that we've got that have been doing stuff for 3 years change the way they're doing things. It's the nature of DevOps or security is that there's better ways of doing things. There's smart hackers out there, and they force innovation at a faster pace than we often realize. So keep up to date with the AWS services. AWS does have a page or things. There used to be an email, which I haven't received a lot recently, but there's a page where you can see new services. Understand, why is the WAF rule set changing? Why is this changing? What is config now doing, or guard duty? And just also, it will help you with a lot of your exams. The more of the services you get a basic background understanding of. So it's if it's your passion, I strongly recommend putting that bit of time in and just keeping up to date with it, or just getting a sense of what's changing or why it's changing. Okay.